It was morning, and the weather was pleasant with the sun shining brightly, casting its rays in all directions. The princess, hearing the sound of horse hooves, came to the balcony from her room. She had received the message that Prince Fahim was coming to meet her. The princess looked at the path leading to the palace, which was surrounded by trees and flowering bushes. She had seen many princes try and fail to meet her conditions, and this thought filled her eyes with sadness. She looked towards the rider approaching from a distance. At that moment, Prince Fahim, riding a beautiful horse, was passing through the flower-lined path towards the palace garden. This path, coming from the direction of the forest, was adorned with flowers. The prince passed under a beautiful arch and rode his horse through the garden gate, speeding down the path towards the center of the palace. Upon seeing Prince Fahim's beauty, his complexion and his strong build, a glimmer of hope sparkled in the princess's eyes. She quickly started walking towards the stairs, and upon reaching the lower floor she began to walk towards the garden. The princess was her father's only child, and after his death, the kingdom had passed into her hands. In the garden, a maid seated the princess at a beautifully decorated table near a fountain made of diamonds, where various colorful flowers in a jade vase greeted the guest. On one side, various covered fruits were arranged on trays. The princess walked over and sat on the chair opposite the prince. As she sat down, the water in the garden fountains began to rise, reaching the sky, while the melodious song of the familiar birds around her filled the air with music. Prince Fahim became lost in the sight of the princess. She was exceptionally beautiful, graceful, and elegant, and nature had crafted her appearance with great care. Her lake-like blue eyes held immense attraction and charm, and he couldn't take his eyes off her. "You are truly a very beautiful princess," the prince said in a pleasant tone. "Thank you, Prince. You also look very handsome and brave," the princess responded in her melodious voice, which echoed in his ears. "I want to marry you," Prince Fahim said, smiling. "Are you aware of my condition?" the princess asked in a serious tone. "I've heard some rumors about finding a magical garden," the prince replied. "I will explain it to you," the princess said, leaning forward on the table and resting her chin on her palms. "One day, I was flying over the sea on my enchanted flying carpet. This carpet was given to my mother by an elder. While flying over the sea, I saw many beautiful and wondrous places from above. However, near a cluster of small islands, I saw the sea waves jumping continuously up to 500 feet high in an organized pattern, which amazed me and sparked my curiosity. I flew the carpet over the waves and looked down. Beneath me, surrounded by the waves, was an extremely beautiful garden located on the land. The beauty of this garden was beyond imagination. It contained many beautiful sights and views. In the center of the garden, there was a lake where a red djinn resided, and many fairies served him. On the island, there were fruits, flowers, green mountains, and animals. Nature's entire spectrum was present there. Any prince who conquers this garden and wins the golden palace of the red djinn for me, I will marry him. Many princes have attempted to conquer the garden, but none have succeeded. The princess finished looking at the prince. I will conquer the island, claim the garden, and free the golden palace for you at any cost, Prince Fahim said passionately, determination written on his face. This will be a life-or-death journey. The princess looked at him carefully. To win you, I can defeat many red and black jinn. How are you so confident? She asked. I will tell you everything, the prince replied. Very well, the princess said, gesturing to the fruits arranged on golden and silver trays. Thank you, the prince said, picking up a red apple from the tray. The princess also reached for a red apple, and they began eating. As she bid him farewell, the princess felt hopeful that this prince might be braver and more handsome than all the others who had come before him. He will surely succeed, as he also possessed his grandfather's enchanted boat, which gave Prince Fahim confidence. For the first time in his life, Prince Fahim opened the red door of the palace and looked at the boat standing by the pond, a boat he had always observed from the window. Today was the time to use it. This boat had been crafted by a magician friend of his grandfather. His grandfather, Shah Rukh, had traveled to an island on this enchanted boat, where a magician had kidnapped his daughter. The island was guarded by crocodiles, bigger than whalefish, in the surrounding waters. These crocodiles were capable of sinking and destroying even the largest ships. Shah Rukh had thrown a magical net towards the crocodiles. The net began to grow, and the crocodiles shrank, becoming smaller than even mice, until they were small enough to be trapped in a magical bottle. Prince Fahim's gaze fell on the boat's counter, where he saw a glass bottle with the crocodiles swimming in it, reduced to the size of lizards. The prince stared at the bottle with fascination and excitement before boarding the boat. He picked up the glass bottle from the dashboard-like part of the boat, studying it carefully. The crocodiles with their red eyes stared back at him. Fahim tapped the glass with his finger, scaring the crocodiles, and they scattered. He placed the bottle carefully in a compartment at the back of the boat. The boat was 25 feet long and 15 feet wide. The prince observed that enchanted words had been inscribed on the front of the boat, which were meant for controlling the boat and using it in special ways in the times of danger. He was filled with wonder when he found a book nearby that detailed how to make the boat perform amazing feats. Excited, he shakily picked up the book. In the morning, after eating the fruit given by the princess, the prince boarded the boat. By turning the word Aleph, the boat sprang to life, jumping out of the pond and quickly heading towards the open doors of the palace. The magical eye at the front of the boat automatically determined the path, avoiding any walls or obstacles by taking another route. In a state of amazement and joy, the prince leaped to the deck and watched as the boat swiftly moved through various paths before jumping grandly into the water at the beach. It moved with speed, leaving other boats and ships behind. The prince stood before a golden mirror on the boat, where he had been advised by his grandfather. Whenever there was a long and dangerous journey ahead, he should board the boat and stand before the golden glass, which would determine the destination. The boat would then head towards it. As the prince gazed into the mirror, he saw an image of the sea waves crashing harmoniously, and he smiled in delight. The boat sped on, leaving other vessels behind. The prince picked up a slender round mirror from the counter and looked towards the cluster of islands in the distance. These islands appeared as black dots on the horizon. The boat raced across the surface of the water with great speed. A sailor, who was observing from another boat, marveled at the sight of the enchanted boat. Suddenly, a massive whirlpool appeared around the boat, trapping it and spinning it like a helpless twig. But the prince did not panic. He opened the enchanted book and placed his hand on the glowing word Jim, pulling it. The boat jerked violently and then soared into the air, flying for a distance of a mile, before landing back on the water's surface. The prince, thrilled, admired every part of the boat as the journey continued. By midday, the boat reached the islands. The prince noticed waves on the right side of the cluster, jumping up to great heights in a continuous circular motion towards the sky. Suddenly, a sharp rock emerged from the sea, causing the water to churn violently. The boat began to wobble, but within moments, the top of the sharp rock broke into pieces, and the fragments moved towards the boat. Many spearheads, harpoons, and sharp stone fragments began to fly towards the boat. The prince quickly placed his hand on an enchanted, glowing word. Immediately, a transparent shield spread around the boat, and stones of various sizes, large and small, began to strike the shield forcefully. The boat started spinning rapidly, and some of the smaller, pointed fragments of stone flew off behind the boat. As the boat turned, the pointed stones continued to strike the shield, creating holes that quickly filled in and vanished. At that moment, the prince's gaze was drawn to the tall, rocky shore of one island in the cluster. A lone tree growing there began to transform into a net, roaring fiercely as it swung toward the boat. Fear spread through the prince's eyes. The net landed on the boat in an instant, and the prince felt the boat's domed glass tremble from the net's force. The tree's trunk morphed into the face of a terrifying creature that was now approaching the boat, its long red tongue darting out like a dagger, cutting through the boat's front glass and coming straight for the prince. The prince, displaying bravery and quick thinking, unsheathed his sword and skillfully sliced through the red tongue, which lashed out like a flame. With a terrifying scream, the creature recoiled, and the grip of the net began to loosen. Just then, the jagged stone fragments that had been scattered earlier returned, piercing the glass of the boat from behind and entering the interior. Hearing the noise, the prince quickly ducked and sat down. The stone fragments, their edges glowing red with heat, cut through the glass and lodged themselves in the creature's mouth, causing it to let out a monstrous shriek. The net began to break apart. One of the stone fragments got caught in the enchanted words, and the prince watched in awe as the struggle between the words and the stones unfolded. Eventually, the stone broke apart, and the glowing words turned it into dust, which fell to the floor, now sizzling hot with a red glow along the edges. The prince had never seen such terrifying scenes before. Despite his bravery, he was drenched in sweat, and every nerve in his body stood on end. As the net broke and the creature sank into the sea, the massive rock that had risen from the ocean exploded with a tremendous force, scattering bright light. This was the rock the creature had created to destroy seafaring ships. After sinking the ships, the creature would use its tongue to drink the blood of the sailors. It was an ally and helper of the Red Jinn. The prince read these words as they appeared in the second frame of the golden mirror, glowing brightly before dimming. He stood in astonishment as the boat began to move towards the ocean waves, which rose majestically, reaching great heights. The waves produced a beautiful, melodic roar that filled the air, like the sea telling its story to the sky, as if the waves were singing their song to the heavens. The prince marveled at the breathtaking view when suddenly a powerful wind began to clash with the rising waves. A large bird, resembling a raven, flew toward the waves, but was struck by an unseen force and fell, screaming into the distance. A wave of terror gripped the prince's heart. But in that moment, he quickly thought of something and pulled a word from the book. A brilliant beam of light, like a torch, shot from the front frame of the boat, colliding with the waves below. The impact created a large gap in the water, and the boat, now fully in motion, leaped into the air, soaring and passing through the void before landing in the garden. Upon entering the garden, the prince was left speechless, his fingers nervously gripping his teeth. He was unable to blink his eyes in awe. The garden was incredibly beautiful, with wide, bright white stone pathways and blue lights emanating from the roots, casting a soft, radiant glow. The garden was divided into various large areas with sapphire-like rocky fields, and the dense trees were unlike anything the prince had ever seen. They were enormous and thick, more so than any trees he had encountered before. Astonished, the prince turned his head from side to side, taking in the view of the expansive garden and its breathtaking landscape. On a large tree, the prince saw a parrot, bigger than an ostrich, pecking at an apple the size of a watermelon. As his gaze slid off the parrot, it fell upon a giant, tower-like mountain, from which water was splashing up high, resembling a waterfall. The waterfall cascaded down like a veil and flowed into a winding stream, finally entering the fountain chamber. The circulation of the water was a mesmerizing sight, and the boat moved slowly ahead. At this point, the prince noticed an astonishing sight on the right side of the plot. On a round road, there was a giant rat sitting on a cart that resembled a horse-drawn carriage. The cart was pulled by small elephants the size of goats, and the rat was whipping them. The prince couldn't help but laugh. In the back of the cart were the children of jinn and fairies laughing joyously. Then, the prince saw another spectacle that made him gasp in astonishment. Above a small lake, a bird larger than an ostrich circled in the air, and as it flew it would suddenly lay an egg, which would quickly float across the water and travel a great distance. And the bird would then swoop down, pick the egg up with its long beak and swallow it. Watching this, the prince couldn't contain his laughter. At that moment, the prince noticed the icy region of the garden at the far end of the plots, where snow-capped mountains and tunnels and caves within them were visible. The prince was again surprised by what he saw, then smiled. On top of one of the snowy peaks, part of the snow melted quickly into water, which then flowed down into a pond. But soon, the water would freeze back into ice and rise back up to its original place on the mountain. A cool wave of joy and pleasure surged through the prince's body. Such fascinating and wondrous sights, he muttered to himself. In a deep plot, the prince observed 2 seats on opposite banks of a lake. As children sat on the seats suddenly tilted and rose into the air, reaching a height of 30 to 40 feet. The seats would then shake, tossing the children into the air, and they would fall onto floating red cushions in the lake below. Immediately, various fruits appeared on golden trays in front of them. The children looked delighted, their rosy, beautiful skin glowing. The boat came to a stop. Ahead, a large lake spread out, and the paths around it narrowed into scattered routes. The prince gazed at the scene in interest. In the middle of the lake, beautiful colors were shimmering, and suddenly, the prince gasped in awe. A magnificent golden palace was slowly rotating above the water. The sight was so enchanting that the prince was left spellbound. From the roof of the palace, a golden throne, surrounded by beautiful fairies and the red jinn, flew into the air, gliding above the lake's surface. The golden throne soared over the lake's central field and landed on a raised platform in the garden, surrounded by diamonds and jewels. This was the jinn's court. From behind the trees in the garden, many beautiful fairies emerged, bowing to the throne of the red jinn. Flowers and buds bloomed on the plants. The prince stood frozen, mesmerized by the stunning spectacle. Such a magnificent reception! If only this reception could be for me and the princess, the prince muttered. A few fairies began dancing in front of the red jinn, and the air filled with the sweet sound of birds singing. Just then, the jinn's singular red eye turned towards the boat that was parked on the back road. It reached out its right claw toward the rope. Without wasting any time, the prince quickly launched a glowing orb from the boat towards the jinn in the garden. Immediately, there was an explosion, and a torrent of blinding light erupted, so intense that it was impossible to see with the naked eye. The prince quickly tied a glass rod to his eye and with remarkable precision used the enchanted trap, made of magical words to throw it towards the jinn's neck. As the jinn screamed in agony, its cries echoed through the garden. The fairies scattered in fear. In that moment, as the red jinn was dying, it quickly uttered some words and loudly commanded, "Island, fly towards the sun." With that, the island, with its lush garden, began to tremble and rise into the air. The prince, startled, rushed back into the boat. On the white stone of the boat he read an inscription that said, "This island is artificial, created by magic," and was sent towards the sun by the dying jinn. The island quickly soared higher into the sky. The prince went near the jinn and saw that it was dead. He turned back towards the boat, only to be horrified to see the red jinn's loyal dwarf had taken the bottle and released the crocodiles. These crocodiles, upon hitting the ground, grew larger and larger at an alarming rate, soon reaching the size of fish, but with the same ferocity. They looked around, then charged towards the prince. The intensity of their breaths caused the prince to feel his feet weakening. One crocodile, in a fit of rage, grabbed the boat in its jaws and hurled it far away, causing it to crash into a tree. The wild creatures began relentlessly chasing the prince. Meanwhile, the island was flying swiftly towards the sun. The prince realized that everything on this island and its garden had been created by magic. He ran as fast as he could, with the bloodthirsty crocodiles chasing him, their hissing breaths echoing in his ears. The island continued to soar toward the sun while the water of the lake overflowed, flooding the dry parts of the land and spreading through the garden like a storm. The intense heat from the sun increased the temperature, making the already scorching environment unbearable. The plants, flowers, and smaller birds withered in fear, taking flight in the oppressive air. However, the prince managed to use the flood to his advantage. The crocodiles, struggling against the powerful torrents of water, were swept away and scattered. The prince found a high platform and stood on it, waiting for the floodwaters to subside. When they did, he jumped into the water and began to swim. After a short while, he decided to seek refuge in a tall tree. From there, he waited for the water to drain from the lower parts of the garden. Meanwhile, the beautiful fairies drifted helplessly, some of them panicking and locking themselves in their homes within the garden. The dwarf, Jinn, also found itself floating away on the water. When the water from the lakes and ponds finally gathered in the lowlands, the prince descended from the tree. He began to regret not having kept the bottle with the crocodiles in it, either in the palace or in his pocket. At that moment, he saw another glass bottle floating in the water. This one contained a man trapped inside, who appeared to be a sorcerer. The prince hurriedly grabbed the bottle and, upon inspection, realized that the man inside was indeed a magician. He picked up the bottle and began searching for his boat in the trees. It didn't take long before he spotted it. He cautiously approached the boat, climbed into it, and noticed an inscription on the boat's surface. It read, "Open the mouth of the bottle." The prince opened the bottle, and as he did, a mist poured out. The sorcerer emerged from the bottle, rising into the air, and grew into his full ancient form. He then clung to one or two of the tree branches. The prince watched in awe as the sorcerer greeted him. "My helper, the sorcerer," the prince said, still in a daze. The sorcerer, now fully transformed, shook the prince's hand and replied, "Who are you?" "I am the unfortunate sorcerer who created this enchanted island and the beautiful garden upon it," the sorcerer began. "At the request of my friend, the king's son, I created the garden." But when the red jinn saw how beautiful it had become, his intentions were corrupted. He tricked me and locked me inside this bottle. Now, the king and his 10-year-old son are trapped in the icy mountains, held captive in a cave. We must rescue them immediately." The prince, sweating profusely in the scorching heat, gestured to the wilting plants and flowers around him. "This unbearable heat is scorching everything. The plants are dying and the birds are in a state of panic." The sorcerer replied, "To stop this, I must continuously recite my incantation. You must go and rescue the king and his son." The sorcerer explained that he had been freed from the bottle after 100 years. Air and food had entered the bottle through small holes in its surface. The prince, now understanding the urgency, grabbed something from the boat, quickly climbed down the tree, and sprinted towards the ice mountains, which were burning under the relentless heat. At that moment, the island was against the intense heat of the sun, causing the ice mountains to begin melting. The prince, running at full speed, entered the desired cave and continued deeper into it. This place was cold, and the prince felt relief as the coolness eased his body. After running for a long time, he entered a room made of ice, where 2 coffins were placed on raised platforms. The coffins had large holes for air, and inside, the king and his 10-year-old son were lying. The prince opened the coffins and freed them, informing them of the situation as they exited the cave. The king and his son began to rush back, with the prince carrying the boy on his shoulder, since the child could not run fast. The boy held a book in his hands, gripping it tightly as they moved. As they emerged from the cave, a crocodile appeared in their path. The prince, facing the creature with unwavering courage, hurled another sphere of light into the open mouth of the crocodile. The sphere exploded immediately, sending sparks into the creature's mouth, which caused it to thrash and writhe in agony. The heat from the light burned its mouth, and it convulsed violently until it finally went still. The prince and the king watched it die from inside the cave. Once the creature was dead, they exited the cave and rushed toward the tree where the boat was tied. The boat looked narrow from above, but the prince, along with the king and the young prince, reached it safely. The sorcerer was still reciting his incantations. Suddenly, the atmosphere seemed to pause before the island began descending back toward its original position. The king and his son embraced their sorcerer friend, thanking the prince for his help. The island returned to its place in the sea, and through the sorcerer's magic, everything in the garden returned to its previous beauty. The water returned to the lakes, the flowers bloomed again, and the fairies gathered in the garden. With the death of the red jinn, the waves surrounding the island ceased. The king turned his attention to Prince Faham, who explained everything that had happened. The king was overjoyed and expressed his gratitude to the prince. The king then shared the story behind the garden. He explained that the garden had been created by his sorcerer friend Solomon at the request of his son. The young prince had once read about a garden like this in a book about a mystical island. The king revealed that during their visit to the garden, the evil jinn had imprisoned them, preventing them from fully experiencing the beauty of the garden. The king, the prince, and the sorcerer Solomon began to tour the garden together. The prince then sent for Princess Fool, asking her to join them in the boat. It was decided that the king and the young prince would live in the Golden Palace, while another magnificent golden palace would be built for Prince Faham and Princess Fool, where they would live after their marriage. The wedding of the prince and the princess was a grand celebration, with fairies performing a splendid dance. The princess was overjoyed. The section of the garden with the most magical wonders was designated for children, and soon families from neighboring kingdoms arrived, eager to see the wonders of the garden. Children and adults alike marveled at the sights, and the garden became known as one of the greatest wonders in the world. The sorcerer Solomon informed Prince Faham that his grandfather, Shahrokh, had been the one who had created the boat. The prince thanked the sorcerer, and the crocodiles were once again caught in the net, shrunk down, and imprisoned in the same bottle. The bottle was placed back on the boat's spikes, and the boat was positioned on a platform in the garden.